Good afternoon to all of you. Greetings and welcome to the expert panel discussion, Rethinking Sri Lanka's Transport and Logistics Sector, organized by Centre for Banking Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Now, as an institution which is into building the capacity of financial sector professionals of the country, and also into creating awareness on timely topics with interest in economics, Central Bank Studies, or rather CBS, has selected another very important discussion area for today's expert panel. It is the transport and logistics sector. So today's keynote address will be delivered by Professor Amal S. Kumarage, Senior Professor, University of Moratuwa, and his speech will be followed by a discussion that would take place with the participation of experts representing different corners of this sector. The keynote address will take around 45 minutes, roughly, and then we'll be having more than an hour for the panel discussion. Today's panel consists of Mr. Ramesh David, Chairman of National Logistics Committee, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and Dr. T. Sivakumar, former President, Sri Lanka's Society of Transport and Logistics, and also a senior lecturer attached to the University of Moratuwa. And then we have Mr. Jeffrey Sulfa, founder and CEO of Pick.me, the famous rideshare app. And also today's panel discussion will be moderated by Ms. Subhashini Abhesingha, Research Director, Verite Research. So on behalf of Central Bank, let me very warmly welcome all of you to the discussion. And as all of you know, this event is also being live streamed on official Facebook page of Central Bank of Sri Lanka simultaneously, apart from Zoom. So our participants can direct their questions through the Q&A option in Zoom or as a comment on the Facebook post. During the discussion, we'll take those questions in discussion. And without taking time now, let me have the pleasure of introducing today's keynote speaker, Professor Amal S. Kumarage to you. Professor Kumarage is a transport sector professional with over 35 years of experience in academia, government, and consulting. As an academic and researcher, he has set up several academic programs and a department of study at the University of Moratuwa, where he is currently a senior professor. He has published extensively in transport planning, public transport, traffic engineering, road safety, transport project appraisal, and urban transport. He has served as advisor to several ministries in the government of Sri Lanka, as well as the Maldives. He has served as a World Bank and ADB consultant, both in Sri Lanka and many other Asian countries. As an administrator, he has served 3 times as the chairman of the National Transport Commission and on several other statutory bodies over a period of 20 years. He has been instrumental in introducing a fares policy for bus transport, as well as several reform programs, and introduced traffic impact assessment and computer-based traffic signal controls to Sri Lanka, and the transplant demand estimation model, and developed several transport sector master plans and strategic plans from time to time. He is currently engaged in promoting public transport, sustainable urban development, and safe travel. He holds a civil engineering degree from University of Moratuwa and a PhD in transport planning and engineering from University of Calgary. He is also a chartered engineer, fellow, and former chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, where he also held the post of an international vice president. He was also vice president of the East Asia Society for Transport Studies, and he's the founder president of Sri Lanka Society for Transport and Logistics, Translog Consulting, Research, and Road Safety Foundation, Sri Lanka. So with that rich introduction, let me invite Professor Kumarage to commence the speech. So over to you.
Thank you, Kushan, and also thank you to Mrs. Samaratunga, Director, for inviting me to deliver the keynote address for this expert panel discussion. I think a very timely topic, and I'm very honored to be delivering this. Good afternoon to the audience and participants. And since I am currently overseas, I actually, a short while ago, recorded this session, and it will be played to you. And I will meet you live on the other side of the presentation. Over to you, Kushan. Rethinking Sri Lanka's transport and logistics sector has to necessarily begin with asking the question why we are where we are. Of course, any policy, including transport policies, are formed by an amalgam of many aspects: political ideologies, cultural practices, the kind of planning process that goes in, policies that are followed by different governments, the initiatives taken by different ministers, and so on. Now, looking back, in terms of distinct transportation policies over the last 70 odd years, we can identify them to form three different periods. Obviously, before independence, under colonial rule, we had a transport system and infrastructure development program that was aimed at economic gain. For example, tea grown in the highlands of Sri Lanka were moved by road and rail to the port of Colombo, and from there shipped to London and where the blending houses were. And the supply chain extended to markets within the UK and even outside into other countries of the British Empire. The supply chain also worked for imports to Sri Lanka from those very countries, particularly the UK. Manufactured goods came to the port of Colombo to be distributed by this very same road and rail network across the length and the breadth of the country. Now, the British, in order to ensure this economic process, developed their urban areas very well. The transport systems in our cities, particularly Colombo and even in Kandy, was one of the best in Asia at that time. However, they willfully neglected or ignored the mobility requirements of the rural areas of the country because it did not yield much economic benefit to the British. Now, when Sri Lanka got independence, our politicians moved to address this imbalance in mobility. And we see over the first 20 years or so, a lot of rural roads being built, bus services being promoted, affordability of public transport becoming a primary criteria to ensure that people were able to move to the services that were being provided, mostly the welfare services, the education, the jobs that were being opened up in the government sector. And many subsidies and services were offered to move people to between homes and places of social and economic development. So from the British time, where the focus was on the movement of goods, after independence, it moved to the focus of people from economic objectives more for welfare and social objectives. The formation of the CTB and many other transportation policy initiatives were geared towards this objective. In 1977, with the introduction of the open economy, there were changes that happened to the transport system from the year after. The state monopoly was opened up for private entrepreneurs into the bus industry, and motor vehicle imports were liberalized. But however, we find that the previous policies, the welfare policies, also remained together with the open market policies. And therefore, to date, we have this mixture or this dualistic process of, on the one hand, subsidizing transport and on the other hand, trying to make transport a commercial or paying business. This confused state has been the primary reason why some of those policies that were initiated in the 1950s and 60s, even though outdated, are still being implemented today. Now, if we actually look at the government policy statements during these last 30 years or so, we find that in 1992, there was a policy document. In 2009, there was another one which was approved by the government, the Cabinet of Ministers, as technically is this transport policy even today. And in 2018, another proposal, and 2020, there is a current draft under preparation, which I believe has not moved forward. Now, I have been looking at how well we keep within stated policy. And I have looked at the 2009 policy document and picked up 100 policy recommendations, interventions in that document, and examined how much progress has been made with respect to each of them. Now, under railway transport, you can see that 11 of those policy recommendations have not made any progress. One has made a low level of progress and another one moderate, and nothing has been completely fulfilled. It's about the same in terms of omnibus transport. And if we move forward to hiring vehicles, again, we see no progress at all. So is this case for vehicle administration, for development of non-motorized transport, goods transport and logistics, and even urban transport. Now, if you want to study these in more detail, I must announce that this table, as well as many other tables in my presentation, can be sent to you if you send me an email. The email address is given on some of these slides. This will be published by the Journal of South Asian Logistics and Transport towards the end of this month. Now, again, going further into other areas, subsidies for transport, again, not much progress. Transport administration, none at all. Energy efficiency, some progress. Safety and security, we have one item that has been fulfilled. And then in terms of the environment, we have 2 items that have been fulfilled. So out of 100 policy interventions that have been recommended 13 years ago, we have completed 3, 11 in partial progress, 86 where nothing has moved. So we cannot but come to the conclusion that we have not been policy oriented. We have not implemented things according to policy. And it's not that things didn't happen at all. It was things that were outside of policy that happened and not what was within the stated policy. Now, of course, many countries and Sri Lanka similarly have what is called implied policies, programs that have come into being at some point in time and are continuing. And by spending money on a regular basis through the budget, they become de facto policy, which we call implied policy. And as you can see, there are many such programs for which money is voted annually. And many such administrative procedures are there. And it's giving subsidies for students, for travel in public transport, operating rural bus services, in terms of controlling the fares on buses and railways, in differential taxation between petrol and diesel fuel,
and in tax levels imposed on the different kinds of or types of vehicles, and also this practice, the controversial practice of giving duty-free or duty concession vehicle permits, which has gone on for quite a while. Now I have looked at whether any of these policies, some of them which have been introduced nearly 60 years, over 60 years ago, most of them over 50 years ago, have been reviewed and readjusted from time to time. Of course, numbers have been changed, percentages have been changed. But in terms of reviewing whether those are actually benefiting the targeted beneficiaries, whether there is actually economic productivity by having these subsidies and these programs and these tax structures, and what it is doing to both the transportation sector development as well as the economic and social development of the country. And what I find is that we really don't review policy. Once something is there, we just keep operating that for years and decades and decades. So most of these have gone on, and I believe if we do review them, as I have done personally, we will find that many of them are now outdated and do not meet the original objectives at all. Now, this is actually the reason why we are where we are. And if actually we look at some of the key, the most significant reasons why Sri Lanka had a dollar crisis, transport is one of the reasons. And if you can look at this picture, the total importation of petroleum imports into Sri Lanka during the period 2014 to 2018, we were spending almost an equal amount for the importation of fuel into this country as we were for the importation of all kinds of consumer items, including food, beverages, milk, household items, equipment, appliances, medical, and drugs. Now, can we as a country that does not produce even a drop of fuel be completely vulnerable to importing so much of or spending so much of our income, foreign income, on fuel alone? Now, 61% or 62% of this amount goes into transport. And this amount was actually when a barrel of oil was $50 on average. But now, as you know, it has exceeded $100. It went to even $120. Now, obviously, if we were to consume at that same rate, we would have exceeded $6 billion. And that would have constituted something like 30% of our importation just for oil. Now, a reason why we are in this is because many of those policy recommendations set out in 2009 and even in subsequent documents were completely disregarded. And we have a transportation sector that is highly energy inefficient. And this is a reason why we became vulnerable to high oil prices. Now, if you actually add the money we spent or we spend on import of vehicles, the import of fuel, and also the foreign expenditure on road construction, even at $50 a barrel, this is over 20%. At $100 a barrel, it's over 30%. Now, as a non-oil producing country, can we afford to spend nearly 1/3 of our importation on fuel alone? So somewhere down the line, we missed the bus or the train in terms of positioning those very modes as the most central modes of transport. And we know that in recent times, people were willing to not use their cars, even though they had been using them for years, and go by public transport. But many found that it did not meet their requirement in terms of the convenience, the comfort, the reliability that a public transport service should give in the modern world. So obviously, we have made ourselves extremely vulnerable, and we are now paying the price for that. It's not only the dollars that we have lost. Actually, I calculated the amount of tax that has been foregone by the Treasury by the importation of vehicles, mostly high-end vehicles under concessionary duty permits. And it appears that we have been losing around $94 billion rupees per year. Whereas the total tax that we have got from the importation of all private vehicles, or private cars more precisely, is also 97 billion rupees per annum. So we seem to be losing a huge amount. 94 billion is something that if you could even have spent half of that, put half of that into public transport, we would have had one of the best public transport systems in this part of the world. And we can still do that if we readjust some of these implied policies and programs that have gone on without being reviewed. The same goes for capital investment. And in spite of the 2009 policy saying that investment must be focused more on public transport, which is necessary for a high population density country, we have almost gone the other way of spending nearly 2% of our GDP in some years for the road sector, and taking something like 70% of the investment just for the road sector, neglecting the public transport sector. And that is why we are now paying with a very high fuel bill. And that is why we have to wait in line, because we have not had a sustainable transport policy. Now, when you talk about policy, it's a bit of a problem in Sri Lanka, because you really don't know what is meant by policy. If we look at corporate policy, we know that generally these policies are top-down. The shareholders and then appoint the board of directors. They formulate the policies. They first have a vision for the company, or a mission for the company. They set their objectives and goals in terms of what they want to be in 5-10 years, and then they set their policies to achieve those goals. And of course, they have the tools to achieve those goals through those policies, through what we will call strategies. They will have an HR strategy. They will get the kind of CEOs they want, or the COOs they want. They will invest in the technology that is required and into other infrastructure that is required. And that will be the strategy through which they will reach their policy goals. And if the management is unable to reach those targets, they are accountable to the shareholders through the AGM. And then there may be certain changes that are made if that company is unable to meet those goals on a regular basis. Now, however, when we look at the usage of the word policy in government, it's not the same. So we talk about government policy. And essentially, any government policy must look at the three critical areas of economy, society, and environment, at least with respect to transport. You can add other things like security and so on. And these government policies, which ideally should have been presented to the people and on the basis of which a government comes into power, should translate into sector strategies. And how does a sector strategy work? On the one hand, we have the ability, the power for a government to implement its policies through acts of parliament, through legislation, to set up institutions and laws that will guide investment and operation of transport services and infrastructure. And on the other hand, they can vote money, make cabinet decisions, issue circulars to implement certain practices, to spend money that has been allocated through parliament for various programs. And these we call the implicit policies or the programs. The earlier one would be called the explicit policy or policies. The third way in which government will implement a transport strategy would be by directives and projects. And we see this happening all the time. Many of our ministers would be very good at directing the institutions. And the entire bureaucracy is now very much used to being directed by politicians. And in fact, I have seen often a board of directors, a ministry will not know what to do unless there is a minister. And so it seems the way in which strategy works more often than not in Sri Lanka is not through explicit policy, because we saw that in transport, it had less than 5% achievement over 13 years. It's not through implicit programs of which monies are spent, because we see that once such programs are initiated, they just go on, and there's nobody revising them. There's no political will to change any of those for the better. You just keep on doing. It's more by directive. And here we see politicians actually, once they become a minister or deputy, changing the people who and replacing them with people whom they can actually direct. And it's by such individual direction that transport sector has operated in most of the recent years. And when you operate on that basis, you cannot implement policy. You cannot implement programs. You can only implement projects. And this is where we are as a country, that we have been doing projects without proper programs. We have been doing projects without programs and without policies. And this is certainly an option we have going forward, to continue to do this not only in the transport sector, but in all other sectors where this has become the default practice. And of course, in Sri Lanka, we have this added problem whether the stakeholders who actually appoint the government, like the board of directors in a company, really want policy-driven governments. Because if you look at most political manifestos, they have very little policy. They're full of projects. And Sri Lankan voters are captivated more by tangible projects than by conceptual policies. And it seems that instead of educating the voter to the value of policy-driven governance, we have gone the other way of being very populist in terms of offering tangible infrastructure to get votes. Now, even today, amidst this crisis, people ask me, oh, when are we getting the LRT? When are we completing the expressway programs? And when we see, no, we need to have a program for expressway development, we need to integrate that into a policy of mobility for the entire country, and we need to prioritize the investment within that, I seem to be talking to blank faces. So therefore, we have a problem. It's not only the politicians who are to be blamed, but also our bureaucracy has failed to understand policy, failed to interpret and implement and monitor policy. And also, our population does not seem to value policy, or at least demand it. Now, going forward into what we can do from here on now, what kind of new thinking should come in? I would venture to say that we can only think of progression, development, sustainability if we have a policy-driven transport sector. Now, if we were to have a government that values that now or in the future, then here are some recommendations. The first is that we must stop thinking of inside to out. We must stop trying to solve our internal mobility problems first. No, we need to have an outside to inside approach. Think globally first. Patrick Geddes, the famous town planner, who was also instrumental in some of the planning in the early part of the 20th century in Colombo, coined this term, think globally, act locally. Now, that was actually phrasing what the British administration thought. They were thinking globally, but wherever they went, they acted locally. They developed that not merely for the benefit of the local inhabitants, but for their benefit and for their greater objective of global empire building. Now, Sri Lanka is excellently located. There are many people from other countries have sought its strategic location for various strategic reasons. Now, we keep talking about it, but what have we done to actually convert it into a modern logistics hub? And this is what I think in transport we must focus. We need to actually develop our location with the required competencies. Now, in Sri Lanka, we have a number of university programs that produces logistics, supply chain, and transportation managers. We are even having a program for transport management and logistics engineers coming out of the University of Moratuwa. Now, we have in other countries like the UAE and in Singapore, they had to import expertise, expatriates for these expert positions. In Sri Lanka, we have them. We need to exploit that resource. We also have considerably good infrastructure and capacity at this time. It's true, our roads are filled with private vehicles and we need to decongest them to give priority to the movement, efficient movement of goods. That can be done if we improve our public transportation sector. But we do not have the digital infrastructure to actually connect the manufacturers, the transporters, the logistic operators, the clients into one platform, which is becoming absolutely necessary today. And so therefore, if we are to think of becoming a regional hub, which I think is one of the thrust areas, the economic thrust areas we must look at, where transport is not a passive contributor to the economy. It actually drives the economy as it has done before. The weakest link in our mobility sector is the processes and services which are unreliable, expensive, and so on. And this is an area where we need to apply good practices and bring in digital efficiency to make them work as is required in the modern world. Now, in the background of that, our domestic transport services must be very well interlined to that. We must begin with what we have, not keep fantasizing about expensive modern infrastructure that we require. We must first utilize what we have to its maximum, particularly at this time when getting dollars for investment, heavy investment, is going to be difficult. So we must stop thinking in terms of buses and roads and railways and trying to develop them as silos. But people are today thinking in terms of mobility. People are quite willing to move from one mode to another if it gives them the desired mobility. So we must integrate the buses with the railways, buses with private vehicles through park and ride and so on, or even non-motorized transport. And we need to integrate the first mile and the last mile through taxis and so on, and through a digital backbone. Many cities are doing this, even in our part of the world. Similarly, for goods transport, we need to integrate road transport with rail transport and the port and the airport. And again, using technology that is today called Industry 4.0, by having that kind of equipment to streamline the operations from manufacturing to the end customer. Now, I have also listed here a number of strategies that we can adopt, both for the short term and long term, under economic, social, and environmental objectives. I will just talk about the two short-term proposals. One, in the economic front, we must immediately move towards reducing our foreign inputs, reducing our dependency on imported fuel. We do not know for how long this oil price hike will remain. We do not know what will happen next year. It might even go further. And we need to be in a position to be able to manage whatever the pricing is. And we need to have targets by 2024, how we can, for example, ensure that at least 50% of those who use private vehicles on a regular basis have a public mode of transport available for them to use if indeed there is a shortage of oil, or if the price of oil is prohibitive. We also need to have social nets for people, particularly post-COVID, post-economic crisis, whose mobility, because of the increase in prices, may have been curtailed, and their ability to seek jobs, employment, as well as even go to school may have been curtailed. So we need to uphold such people, such segments in society, to make sure that they do not drop below what is permissible. Then we also need to become efficient in the long term. Our transport needs to be efficient, more reliable, more modernized, digitalized. We need to bring in the first mile operations into the mainstream through digital platforms. We need to reduce accidents and set targets. We need to go in for seamless ticketing and real-time information portals for all passenger transport modes. We need to integrate them, the different operators, so that passengers will be able to make decisions by one application. we need to also improve our livability. We need to peg carbon reduction or even carbon zero standard. And this might be a good selling point for our goods in Western markets by the year 2013, when such standards will come into play. I have set down different measures that need to be taken towards each of these ends. Tactical measures to be done immediately, strategic interventions that can be done without change in laws and regulations, and also what policies to retain and what policies that need to. Of course, as I said, you can read this if you want. You can send me an email. I'll be happy to send that to you towards the end of the month. So finally, what are some of the implicit policy changes that are necessary? The first and foremost, I believe that we cannot move forward unless we get our pricing right. At the moment, transportation pricing is done on a piecemeal basis. On one day, the fuel price is shifted around. The next day, vehicle importation prices are moved around. Next day, bus fares are changed. The very next day, rail fares are changed. Duty concessions are changed from motor vehicle. So we are never on a equal playing field. And transport has to be managed as a whole. So what you do in terms of fuel pricing has to be reflected in vehicle pricing. And what you do in those two must also be adjusted with what you do in public transport pricing. You cannot have one policy for rail transport pricing and another for bus transport pricing. And this is basically what happens right now. Nobody is looking at this holistically. And we are dropping the ball at every turn. So first we need to sit and get a policy on transport pricing. And that is urgent implicit policy that needs to go in how these prices are to be managed. We also need to improve our freight transport efficiency by offering concessions or investment holidays to ensure that our logistics, our domestic logistics, our foreign logistics are integrated and are of the highest caliber to meet any international competition. We need to promote a non-motorized transport or active transport by manufacturing the tools and the vehicles needed for that, such as bicycles. We have a bicycle industry, but we need to upgrade the quality and make them affordable to bulk of the people. We need to rearrange how we are spending our budget money. For example, the RDA spending money mostly for construction of roads. Hardly anything goes for non-motorized transport, for pedestrians, for cycling. Hardly anything goes for managing traffic or road safety, for example. So we need to move away from the traditional expenditure of widening roads and building new roads into more effective methods of getting the existing road network to do what it's supposed to do. We need to think of offering tax concessions for large companies to reduce their total fuel bill and the way they use their vehicles. We need to come up with a policy to roll out electric vehicles so that by 2030 or thereafter, we can even go towards a carbon zero transportation system. We need to also think of how we manage the transportation budget. We know that the health sector is a net cost to the government, so is the education sector. But we are very confused about what transport should be, even though that is a service sector. There's really no need for transport to be a loss to the government. And if we have a zero-sum budget policy where taxes are used to subsidize, I think then we will have a transportation a service in this country that is not a burden to the taxpayer. We also need to have explicit policy interventions. A number of them are listed here, and you can go through them. The bus regulations, the railway freight needs to be deregulated, value-added services for passengers. The new bus transport terminals need to be managed more professionally. The Industry 4.0 digital standard must come into all passenger and freight operations in Sri Lanka. We need to think of how we can actually improve state bus management, and also the management and the expenditure for institutions like the RDA, which actually is getting a recurrent expenditure based on the capital money that is given there. So the RDA, in order to maintain itself, must be given larger and larger capital injections in order for it to exist. Now actually, that cost will be even higher than the cost of the losses of the CTB. So we need to separate the state transport operators from the regulators. We cannot have them in the same ministry. It is a conflict of interest. We need to mainstream mobility as a service and give them, the right of passage, so to speak, in the transportation sector. We need to examine the different supply modes in transport, move from traditional models to more practical, flexible models, which need not be the two extremes of private sector and government or nationalized. That there are variations of this can be. We also need to have a policy monitoring process at each step for any money that is approved or spent, to ensure that that is done with policy consistency. So in conclusion, Sri Lanka historically has not been very successful in transport sector policy leadership. And therefore, policy being implemented is actually obsolete, and what is necessary and timely is not implemented. That whole mechanism of reviewing what is there and being able to bring in new policies has broken. So how do we fix this? It is difficult because the political culture, the processes for policy implementation in the wider society is also broken. And therefore, we have directive-driven, project-driven policies that are being, or practices that are being implemented. But when we are ready to move out of that destructive process, we should think of a strategy which is outside to inside, globally to locally. We should bring in Industry 4.0 into forming the base of a regional logistics hub. We need to use the existing domestic transport and logistic infrastructure to upgrade them, modernize them to function efficiently. We need some implicit changes immediately. Some laws need to be changed to ensure this. And above all, we need a policy monitoring and review process to be in place before we begin all of this. And when we are ready to do all of that, I believe we have a golden opportunity to make transport not just efficient and convenient for Sri Lankans, but also as a major thrust area and economic lever for the development of Sri Lanka. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very factful presentation. So it was a real pleasure listening to you all this time. Thank you very much. So with that, we will be now move towards the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Ms. Subhashina Abesinghe. Ms. Abesinghe is an economist specializing in international trade, and she's an expert on Sri Lankan economy, private sector engagement, private sector development, trade policy, regional trade agreements, ports and logistics. In addition to these, her current research include data-driven analysis on China's economic engagement in Sri Lanka. She has a bachelor's degree in economics, first class honors, and a master's degree in economics from University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, and a master's degree in international law and economics from World Trade Institute, University of Bern in Switzerland. She has worked for the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for nearly 10 years as a senior economist. She has also worked as a visiting lecturer at the Faculty of Graduate Studies of the University of Colombo and Sir John Kottala Defence University in Sri Lanka. With that, Ms. Abezinga, let me hand over controls to you for the panel discussion. Now to you.
Thank you very much, Kushan. It is always a pleasure to listen to presentations by Professor Amal Kumarage, and you learn so much every time you listen to a presentation made by him. And while it is a pleasure listening to him, but the content always makes you very sad about where the country is heading and what has happened in the policy environment and how many opportunities we have lost. So it is a pleasure for me to now introduce a panel discussion and the panelists. We have three eminent panelists who are experts in different fields of transport with us. And let me now introduce each one of them. First, Mr. Ramesh David. Ramesh is the Chief Executive Officer of South Asia Gateway, which is Sri Lanka's first public-private partnership project in the port sector. He has also worked for John Keells Holdings for nearly 38 years, where he headed businesses in transportation, including in wide array of areas, ports, bunkering, shipping, logistics, freight forwarding, airline aviation services, and travel. He's a chartered fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Management, and also a past international vice president of the institute. And he is also the president of the Lanka Chamber of Commerce. Outside this experience and expertise in transport sector, what inspired me most when I read his profile was how actively he is involved in encouraging and facilitating participation of women in logistics and transport sector, a sector that is inherently dominated by men. So he is the global advisor. He serves as a global advisor to women in logistics and transport, and he is also a member of the International Finance Corporation's Women in Work high-level advocacy group in Sri Lanka, and he chairs the National Agenda Committee on Transport and Logistics of the Ceylon Chamber, where I also have the pleasure of serving as a member, and I've known Ramesh for a long time and had the pleasure of working with him for a long time as well. Now let me go to Dr. Sivakumar, who is a senior lecturer and former head of Department of Transport and Logistics Management, Faculty of Engineering, University of Moratuwa. He holds a bachelor's in civil engineering from University of Peradeniya and master's in transportation engineering from Asian Institute of Technology, and a PhD in transport engineering from Yokohama National University in Japan. He's the founding secretary and immediate past president of Sri Lanka Society of Transport and Logistics. He was the deputy team leader and country counterpart of the World Bank funded SCTP project based in Kandy. He also has worked in several transport related projects in the country in various capacity. His research interests are in public transportation, transport modeling, optimization, transport survey, active mobility, and road safety. Last, let me introduce Mr. Jeffrey Silver, founder CEO of PickMe. I'm sure everybody in the audience must have at least once used PickMe, which is becoming a very popular mobile app, and that has made transport easy and convenient for most of us. He's the founder and chief executive officer of Pygmy. Jeffrey is a startup entrepreneur with a background of information, communication technology, business and accounting. He's a very well-known name and a respected personality in ICT in Sri Lanka. And as a young professional, he was the recipient of FCCCL Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2004 and ICTA Young IT Professional Award in 2006. He's also he has launched Digital Mobility Solutions Lanka Private Limited, where he is sharing knowledge and expertise in business. And also he's the founder, as I said, of the Pygmy, the first app-based ride-hailing platform, which started in 2015. And has become a very important part of everyday life of most urban Sri Lankans. So welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to have such an eminent panel joining us today, and I'm sure we can have a lively and an insightful discussion. Let me first, and it's also a very timely discussion because both the local and the global developments, while overall has had a very negative impact on Sri Lanka and the everyday lives of many Sri Lankans, like Amal clearly said, in certain areas, it has offered a window of opportunity. And in the past, unfortunately, Sri Lanka has instead of making use of such opportunities, has squandered such opportunities. And in the area of public transport, we have this window of opportunity, and none of these windows last forever. And what is important is that you act in a timely manner. So I would like to turn to Romesh first, especially because just like Amal said, in Sri Lanka, in every government policy, one thing we see is how we aspire to be a regional logistics hub, and we have been aspiring for decades now. And Romesh, you've been leading a business community in this sector, and like Amal said, transport plays a very critical role in making this a reality. I would like to hear your thoughts about how we should be rethinking transport in this area. Over to you.
Thank you, Subhashini, and as always, thank you to the Central Bank for having me on the panel. It is indeed a great honor. And like on every occasion that I have to do so, following Amal is such a challenge because there is very little left to say. But Amal, thank you for that wonderful presentation and synopsis of really what ails us. You know, I think just before that, one of the things that I'd like to just mention is that we have had in a post-independence or in a post-independence era that I have recollection of, I think we've had certain inflection points which very much like the Bard said, if we took it at the flood, it would have gone on to things that were much, much greater. And I think the first one that I recall of such is 1977, when politically there was such a powerful government. And as we know, whilst a lot of good things happened, really nothing beyond that, we failed to capitalize on that. We came again in 2004, I think, when the tsunami, despite all the fractious issues, but again, there was a ruthless sort of opposition through the form of the LTT, and that scuttled any option that we had. Again, in 2009, with the end of the war, I think we had such a point where society as a whole could have changed and could have been made to change. And I think now 2002, we are at a similar point again, where really tough things can be done, where there is recognition across the polity as well as across society that we are in a tough place. And the only way to do it is to really look at the way in which we've been having handouts and doing things in the past. So I think you never waste a good crisis. I think there is opportunity in amongst all the chaos and all the mayhem that we are going through today as a country and as a people. So to touch on what I see, there's not much I can add, and I endorse what Amal says fully. It has to be policy, and it has to be policy that has to transcend politics in terms of, like economic policy, transport policy is very much a part of that, and what we need to do has to transcend the politics of it. A good example is our aspiration to be a hub. I mean, it has been the same thing for the last 45 years. Every single government has said it. But in the end, that becomes lip service, because every single government then changes direction in terms of what we want, what we are doing in order to become a hub. And I think, again, it's an opportunity. But to get down at a bit of a granular level to what we need to do, I mean, we are a hub. We are the primary container transport hub in this part of the world. But we have failed to go beyond that, to turn it into a logistics hub, to turn it into to truly plug it into supply chains, the logistics supply chain for the region, which has powerhouses of production around us. And some of those things have to go beyond the port. It is to do with it is to do with creating value for the big logistics players. We have archaic regulations still. It is really unreasonable that we don't encourage the biggest and the best logistics and transportation companies to come and actually set up on their own here. We should be doing that. The government has an insane desire to hold on to and own land. They've managed to get rid of that through the PPP efforts in the Port of Colombo. These can easily be replicated outside the Port of Colombo, particularly now that these very expensive highways have been built, and there is connectivity within very short distances of Colombo, the port and the airport. We are an island. Connectivity is critical. Air connectivity, we have to hold on. We have to get rid of the nonsense of holding on to monopolies in airport development, in ground handling, in aviation. We just need to get as many aircraft flying here as possible. And we have to get on, and we have to digitize. I mean, we have had Asikoda for 30 years, and we have still not gone the next step. If you take it the other day, the shipping agents were saying, you still need 14 or 17 documents to be handed out for every ship that calls at the Port of Colombo. We still, every single transaction, import and export, is digitally submitted and digitally recorded, but somebody's got to go with a piece of paper and hand the piece of paper over. Now, we came very close to changing all of that with COVID, but unfortunately, we are slipping back into the old ways, and paper is coming back again. So I think digitization, getting everyone onto one platform, having those transactions, we have the enabling legislation, making sure that it happens, and that has to be enforced by the public sector. That desire must come from there. That the mandate must come from there. Just to touch very, very briefly on some of the local initiatives, Amal covered it again fully, but we have to. I think one of the things that we have to do is, we can't, the only kind of divergence of opinion I have with Amal is about the subsidizing of transport, subsidizing public transport. Now, I agree fully that transport has to be affordable for all, but we have extremely vulnerable sections of the community in terms of affordability, and those vulnerabilities have to be anyway addressed. For food, for shelter, for education, they have to be addressed via, I think everyone acknowledges that they have to go via direct transfers. I mean, we have to be able to identify the people who need it most, and then make sure that affordability is placed in their hands. And I think affording transport also should go the same way, because that makes a quantum shift in our approach to transport itself. Transport can then become self-sustaining. It should not need to, it does not need subsidizing. It does not need subsidy from handouts from the treasury in order to happen. So, and then you bring the motive of, performance, you bring the motive of reward based on service into the whole public transport system, which can also then, like in the Sri Lanka telecom model, which can then become effectively PPP as well, which is at the moment difficult to do because it is always subsidy based and there is no profit motive for private sector participation. So next is the shift to public transport. I think we are at a point, given the background of the fuel crisis, we are at a point where we have to do that ruthlessly. We cannot. The private sector also should not be. It is ridiculous the number of cars that people are given, the number of motorcycles, and it just does not work. So we have to move away from that. And government is also one of the biggest culprits. If you look at the ministries, if you look at the armed forces, if you look at the number of vehicles, private or personal vehicles that are cars and vans that are operating, I think we have to continue this fuel rationing in some form or shape, make it more expensive to have tax the private cars more, invest in buses, invest in electrification of those buses and trains, promote women to travel in buses, because again, a huge problem with public transport today is the fact that 50% of our people are women and they are harassed in public transport. So maybe we go the way India went, start with women-only buses, women-only trains, and then morph into something that is acceptable and that as education takes over. But we have to do that. We also, an unpopular view I have is trishaws and school vans. I think we have become lazy on this first mile, last mile. We should be walking to bus stands, walking to train stations. I think we have far too many trishaws, and the school van is a phenomenon that really should be done away with completely. We have a school bus service. That school bus service should be made possible for every single child. It should be of the quality that parents are comfortable using, and therefore we have to, because more than the economic cost of the vehicles themselves in terms of trishaws and vans, I think the cost of having a very employable section, a productive section of the community in terms of young employable males, able-bodied males, sitting around waiting for hires and doing this. I know Jeffrey is going to have a very vibrant opinion on this, but I think that is something that we should look at, and we should look at curtailing. We do not need 1 million trishaws. We do not need 150,000 school vans. It is not necessary, and we need to look at how we can gainfully employ those people, reduce that stock, and I think we will have great benefit through that. Rail is again a no-brainer. We need to get the private sector involved. We need to do it through public-private partnership, and railways have a huge asset in terms of their land base and in terms of the hub, those lands that they have around the hub. I think things like the Makumura hub are fantastic examples of what a multimodal hub can look like and what it can turn into. So we have locations where the railway has locations that can be developed as private sector, public-private partnerships, and where you bring in rail, roll, taxis, private transport, everything into a single hub. And what the fuel crisis, I think the greatest benefit it gave us is people started walking and people started cycling. Amal covered that. I think we should have massive incentives in terms of creating a cycling industry here, electric bikes, and spend money as not so, take some of the money that we're putting into roads and turn it into creating walking areas, particularly in high density urban areas like Colombo, Kandy, Kurunegala. They should be really, we have the free zones that people walk or cycle rather than anything else. And the last thing, again, Amar covered in detail, but digitization is so key. We have the ability, our penetration of smartphones is so great. We have the ability to then make it quite seamless in terms of connectivity for ticketing, for payment of fares, for schedules, and even then using IoT. If you take a shipping line, Hapag-Lloyd by the end of next year will have every single one of their 3 or 6 million containers connected by a device. Now, so we can use IoT for also, to up the game in terms of service, up the game in terms of on-time performance. So I think, none of what I said was not mentioned by Abhal, but I think, so I think we are at the message really is that we really are at a point in time where we can take hard calls about hard decisions, about sacred cows in terms of what we have done in transport and transport policy. which have been held near and dear to everyone for maybe 3 to 4 decades. And we can use this time to actually fracture it. Thanks, Subhashini.
Thank you, Ramesh. That's quite a lot of area you covered from air to sea to land transport. But let me now turn to Siva, because I think Ramesh covered several areas, and also Amal covered several areas about policy. And you're an expert and has done a lot of research in transport demand management. And to me, I felt like most of what Ramesh also touched upon and Amal also touched upon in terms of policy covers quite a lot about how do you manage demand for transport. And transport demand management includes also, is part and parcel of urban planning. I think when Ramesh spoke about cycling, walking, that is very much about urban planning and how do you really incorporate your transport policy into your other development policies and urban development. So I would like to hear, Dr. Siva, your thoughts about Sri Lanka's policymaking culture and the system, and how do we need to change to incorporate more data-driven approach and more technology and modern concepts. Over to you, Dr. Siva.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Professor Amal Kumarige, for explaining and briefing us the history and what is the way ahead. And thanks, Ramesh, again for touching all the areas. So as Subhashini mentioned, yes, this public transport is, we have been saying this and we have been trying to put this in first place for decades. But then, though many has understood the need and many has wanted to do, but then finally it's slipped away for some reason. Maybe the capital investment is less, sadly saying. So this with the transport expenditures, what we have done in the past, we could have give a fraction of it and put that into a public transport improvement. We would have solved a lot of problems what we are facing now. So this public transport has been taken, particularly current scenario due to after the post-COVID and also added by the economic crisis, fuel crisis. So now we are in a golden opportunity. As Ramesh said, every crisis gives an opportunity, so we need to tap into it. So without missing that, we need to take appropriate action now to secure that opportunity. What I'm trying to say is, earlier when we are trying to promote public transport, we are already a public transport prone city. Around 60% was using public transport. Only 40% is approaching the city by automobiles. But then to secure that percentage, we need to proactively react on it. And we were trying to say that and trying to explain that. But now with the crisis, as again both gentlemen touched upon, it's a natural pushing is on the side. That is because of the fuel crisis and so on. People started walking. Earlier, the people were lazy to walk, and now it's people started spreading the word that I walk to the office. I walk this much distance for today, and cycling. So we need to take this as a message around, and we need to change the whole transport system by promoting some infrastructure development towards the active mode of transport, active mobility, that is cycling and walking. Plus, we need to go now. If you look at the demand side from the people, earlier there is a 40% of the private vehicle users. Still they are willing to go with the public transport. Their first question is that the quality of the bus is attractive to move from the private vehicle to the public transport. And then second question they have is the last mile and the first mile, which again Professor Kumarike touched upon. So we need to have some first mile, probably walking and cycling could have been, we can make the environment conducive for that. And also the last mile within the city, where the destination of their trip, also to be served with the proper taxi services and paratransit service as a whole, what I said. Different cities has gone for a ride sharing services and bike sharing services, e-scooters and several other options, which are facilitating the last mile services also. So having these two facilitated, I believe that we could easily expecting a shift from private transport to the public transport. Today, I have seen in the morning a train carrying in the morning around 7:55 with a full of standees holding the guardrail of the engine compartment, which is I have seen only in the pictures of Bangladesh and other places. So it's happening now. I really worried. We should immediately and go ahead and improve the comfort and reliability. So one is there is no question the comfort must be improved. Then the reliability. Reliability is also very important. One is the reliability in terms of punctuality and so on. And then also compared to the other private mode of transport, the buses should operate at a higher speed or a lesser travel time. That only can be possible by some priority measures. There are a lot of priorities measures available, executed in different cities. Colombo, we have tried bus priority lanes. So when there is a again standard says if anything obstacles the public transport, remove from the road. So I'm not saying that remove everything, but then try our level best to give the priority to the bus in terms of signal priority, in terms of the lane priority, in terms of connectivities and seamless transferring from one mode to the other modes of transport. So in many ways, we need to give the priority to the public transport so that people can easily shift at the given situation now. So public transport priority is number one, I would say. And then to do that, there is a push and pull side. So one is the public transport should be attractive, public transport should be comfortable and running at a higher speed. And all these are attractive side of pulling side of the public transport. On the other side, there must be a push side, which is the policy towards this pricing, where again, Amal Kumar touched upon. We need to have some pricing mechanism to push the private people to go from their own mode of transport to the public transport. That is, we don't restrict the ownership of a vehicle, but the usage of the vehicle. So you can have your automobile, you can have your cars at your doorstep, doesn't matter. But at the moment you put it on the road, you got to pay for that service, but it's there. So this is some kind of pushing on that. So it can be a carbon based when the vehicles are entering into the city, automatic toll collections can be done. And the system, modernized equipments and all, it's now very not very expensive, easily can be implemented with less reasonable capital investment we could be able to do. And then on the push side, I also would like to add the parking restriction. All our roads in the urban areas, it's full of parking alongside the road, curbside parking. That's mean the one side of the road or both sides of the roads have full of parking. So we need to restrict or eliminate, fully restrict or restrict the parking, curbside parking. That is called on-street parking. So you need to go for some, you need to provide some, because whenever we are eliminating something, we need to give an alternative to the people. So there must be an off-street parking built to the people, and then we restrict the parking on the streets. particularly in the heart of the city. We should restrict as much as possible. There can be a short-term parking is allowed, that also with a higher price, but then the long-term parking is fully restricted, and we need to provide a off-street parking. And then where the parking should be given is also a very strategic question, because rather than different investors trying to give different parking slots, we should also strategize that locations also, wherever there's bus halt or the major terminals. It can be a railway terminal, or it can be a bus terminal, or it can be bus halt, or it can be attractive locations where the activities are taking place much. So these are the places where the parking must be there, so that people have an alternative choice to take the public transport available, or park and take their modes of transport as they want. And again, this paratransit, I think Sulfur will touch upon in his one. But then paratransit is also very important. As I said, the last mile connectivity is very important. Once you reach your office by public transport, there must be an alternative for you to go to meet your customers and go to dining, or go to meet your client and so on. So there must be a proper last mile connectivity also must be made. So as a holistic picture, we need to touch upon the parking and the pricing and the public transport improvement and the paratransit. These all must be put it as a one package to go at this time. I will, if the time permits, I will come back again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siva. I think some of the areas that you highlighted show the importance of coordination between multiple ministries and agencies as well when you're doing transport policy, because certain aspects like parking or certain restrictions within the urban area may not necessarily fall within the ambit of Ministry of Transport or the Road Development Authority. That clearly shows that transport policy making requires cross coordination and communication between different agencies. And this brings to what Amal said, that this must ideally lead to a policy-driven vision for the country in transport. So thank you very much, Dr. Siva, for your intervention. And now I would like to turn to Jeffrey, who is actually a modern, entrepreneur in the transport field, who has brought in using technology, trying to solve transport problems. Of course, some of I read one of your interviews in Echelon, Jeffrey, where you have said that you actually want one of your missions or one of your aspirations is to make Sri Lankans feel that owning a private vehicle is a liability, and that to discourage it. And that works, that actually complements the overall public transport thinking, that you have less private vehicles on the road. But at the same time, I was reading a research done in China on the Didi app, that shows actually there's two sides to the story. It can be complementary, but it also can be substituting the public transport. And what they found at least in Chengdu in China is that actually the ride-hailing apps are working as substitutes for public transport. So actually what would be very interesting is to see them complement rather than substitute. I would love to hear your thoughts about where do you think Sri Lanka's ride-hailing apps are going. And also, I'm sure you want to respond to Ramesh and his remarks about ride-hailing apps as well. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Yes. Subhashini, can you confirm whether you can hear me?
Yes, very well.
All right, awesome. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. In fact, when Ramesh was talking about three-wheelers, I just wanted to jump in there. But anyway, I think we'll save that debate for another day because I think there's a lot to discuss today. But I think more importantly, I've heard of this regional hub story when I was in school. So you know that I'm coming from Gen Y generation, right? And I think what the professor sort of mentioned today in his presentation sort of reminded me why I went to the Aragali, actually, right? Just the fact that we want a change, we want the right policies put in so that we have a better future for the future generation. I'm not blaming the previous generations, but I think, we as citizens of our country, we We want a better future for us and for our children, right? And I think that's why it is such an important thing that what Professor was mentioning. So I think I come from a technology space, though I work in the mobility sector, but our primary focus is on technology. Just like a ERP software company providing software solutions for a garment industry, we are in the space of technology providing software solutions for the mobility sector. And of course, ride hailing happens to be one, food delivery happens to be another, and of course we're in logistics and stuff like that. So I think the power of technology is something that we all need to look at and sort of embrace and quickly see how we can put this into use to all the sectors possible. And of course, transport is a big use case that technology can be of use. Now, every time I talk about technology, most of the policymakers and government always says, there is always a number of people that will be neglected, right? And I think that is not true anymore, right? Today smartphone penetration is at a very high rate. And of course, a lot of people are using it, right? Today, a cricket match viewed on YouTube attracts more viewers than watched on television, right? And this is fact, right? And more importantly, we saw the digital, the QR, the fuel pass that was rolled out, and I think in terms of adoption, there was never a problem, right? So I think it's just the fact that we have to put it out there, and I think people will start using it, and I think that's something we need to sort of work on, not just in transport but in other sectors as well. So I think Professor Amal also talked about the resources, and I think this is such an important thing. I've noticed a lot of people say that it can't be done in Sri Lanka, right? We have to either import the software and whatnot, right? And I think not just my company, and I can tell you there are other companies out here. We have the talent, right? I think we have the resources. We have some of the best universities. The talent does come out, right? And it's just the fact that we are not giving them enough opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities, right? PicMe is an example. This software was built in Sri Lanka by Sri Lankans, by some of the minds of our universities, and I think that's such an important thing for us to understand, that some of these things can be done here. On the lines of policy, I think we've talked about policy, and of course this has not. I mean, obviously, since I'm talking at a central bank conference, I thought I should highlight this. I think today, as a technology company, we as a startup as well, we look at establishing in Sri Lanka as a disadvantage, right? I have been asked by my own investors, why would you want to stay in Sri Lanka, right? Why don't you go in headquarter in another country, in another country, right? Because there are disadvantages that for us to be in Sri Lanka, because there are advantages given to foreign companies that operate in my space and in other spaces also, if you were overseas, right? And I think and these policies have to be put in place now if we are to see entrepreneurs evolving in the digital space and of course in other sectors using digital in our country. And of course, hopefully one day we will have a unicorn, a decacorn coming from Sri Lanka. I suppose I've said little, but I suppose I've said something very important. I'll pass it back to Subhashini.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yes, I think what Amal also highlighted very much is that digitization and use of technology is vital and critical. And when we are rethinking transport and remodeling transport, that it is very much an area we should focus on. So Amal, I would like there were a lot of comments and a lot of observations made on your presentation and the content. I would like to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the observations and the comments made, and also any additional thoughts you would like to add. On my part, Amal, I have just one question. When we are rethinking policy, you have also been on the side of the government as well and on the policymaking space. So given your experience, it would be very interesting to understand one of the challenges that Sri Lanka has is that we seem to know what went wrong. we seem to know what we want to do, want get done, but we are just somehow failing to bridge that gap and actually acting on it. And when we are rethinking, it's really, we say politics, but that politics will be the elephant in the room, and we can't get it out, right? So that also means we have to deal with it and understand how do you really manage within the political context as well. So I would really like to hear your thoughts from your experiences. How can you really make this work? Thank you.
Yes, Subhashini. So I'll try to answer your question and some of the questions that have been posted on the Q&A as well. Yeah, so taking your last comment about my experience in government and, I mean, the frustration with which I speak. And I think Romesh captured it by saying whenever he hears me speak, it makes him sad. So that's the bitter truth, that the truth is making us sad and not glad. And I think borrowing what Sulfa was talking about, why he joined Aragalaya, and I think we need to take it to every sector. We need to turn things upside down. It's not that we don't have the resources, not that we don't have the ideas, not that we don't have the people. Actually, if you look at the investment that goes into the transport sector, we should be somewhere else. It's not that we have not had money to put in. I mean, there are many countries that never had the money to put into the sector and are where they are, but we have spent money and we are where we are. So I think we need to be, more assertive, or I don't want to go to a stronger word, but I think in what we are doing. And I go around apologizing to the millennials and the X and the Y gen as the preceding generation. Probably we were not aggressive enough in our youth. I don't know whether Romesh will agree with me on that, but I guess we weren't taught to be aggressive in that sense. We expected the system to deliver things, and it has not for want of trying either. So I think the system changes that need to happen, not only in transport, in education, all of this, I think, will have to come through fair amount of pushing, holding people accountable, and taking leadership. And I hope Sri Lanka will have enough willpower and particularly motivation for people to stay and see those systems come into being, than leave the country and relocate physically or relocate your businesses, because it's easier to do so on the other side of the fence. Now, touching base on some of the questions, there's a question asked about fuel pricing and about CPC. Now, there are many people who are actually blaming the CPC for this current crisis. Now, CPC has its own issues which need to be addressed, but the issue of spending so much on fuel, the issue of fuel pricing is actually not so much because of CPC, but because of Treasury and how they have set prices. I'm not sure exactly what the situation is now, but 2 months ago, even after the increase in fuel prices, Sri Lanka's pump price was one of the lowest in the world for a non-oil producing country. So we have actually subsidized what other countries tax. A lot of private vehicle transport today is subsidized. I don't want to go into that. I mean, all the transport costs have increased, but expressway tolls have not increased. Okay, I mean, just one example, right? So I think there is a lot of de facto policy to promote the private vehicle as the mainstream mode of transport, which is completely a mismatch for a country like Sri Lanka, both from an economic perspective and from a demographic perspective. We cannot sustain that. I mean, if you actually look at the money that is locked in with our private vehicles, the 5 or 6 million private vehicles that are operating today, it's about $15 billion. $15 billion at least is locked in to our rolling stock on the road, right? Now, we did a proposal several years ago to modernize the entire bus industry in Sri Lanka, 25,000 buses, with, all the bells and the whistles that one can think of. We will need only a maximum of $1 billion. Okay, that's 1/15. But every year we spend about 3 billion importing hordes of vehicles. Why? Because the Treasury thinks it can get tax revenue by doing that. The Treasury thinks it can get tax revenue by importing fuel. So we've been going on this very mythical belief that, short-term tax revenue, fiscal revenue, and you're actually burning the candle at the other end. And finally, the economics has caught up with us. So I think we need to take this challenge to places like the Treasury, and I'm happy to say this on a CBSL platform, right? These things have to start happening from the top. And that's why I picked pricing as the most, I think, influential variable that can actually bring this to a workable platform. So that's what I want to add to that. Any other questions maybe we can take up later, Subhashini. That's all for now.
There's another one question maybe Amal you would like to answer about reviving old policies as opposed to designing new policies, and what are the pros and cons. I mean, also I also want to know, because you've been in policy making space, when you design a new policy, do you throw away everything in the old policy, or do you actually take on the good and the relevant and then remove the outdated ones? And then, every time you do policy, do you start from scratch? Maybe that is an important thing to understand. Another problem that you said is we never review our policies, right? So when you review policies, it's not just the design of the policy and the policy recommendations, but I guess implementation as well needs to be reviewed, and the impact has also been reviewed. So I would really like to, basically understand from your perspective in the policy making, where do you think transport policy should be going from here onwards? Should we rely on the old policy, or what needs to be done?
Yeah, so whenever I have been part of some kind of policy drafting, committee or whatever, the sort of TOR is very confusing, because, you get the feeling that all what is expected is a list of projects at the end of it. Some kind of list that, a secretary or a minister can, go and, do their pet projects. To me, as I tried to explain earlier also, first we need to know whether we really need a new policy. Policy is an interventionist instrument. So if everything is fine, you don't need any policy. And if everything is not fine, then you need to find out why it is not happening. And very often there is a lot that you can do within existing policies through administrative changes. A cabinet decision doesn't really need to go through all these processes of, legal documentation and so on. They can be done virtually overnight. So I think often policy is a red herring, it's sort of there to make sure that things are made very complicated and it's made impossible. Now, both Ramesh and Sulfa identified some of the key obstacles that need to be removed in their respective industries. Now those are, all of them are archaic, regulations that need to be streamlined to fit our modern world. And there's no way we can become, an international logistics hub with, with policies like that, So that's why I'm saying, if we are thinking of change, let's work on what we need to do to become internationalized, digitalized. And I believe that we have an opportunity. We all talked about opportunities, and I believe that we have missed all the waves. I mean, like industrialization, computer, we have missed. And now we have this digitalization. That's not the same as computer or ICT. It's using data effectively. So a lot of institutions have computers, but they don't know what to do with the data, the richness of the data, and how to use your data to run the business better. So can we, there are many countries now that have come. Vietnam is one, Rwanda is another, that have actually caught this wave, and they have propelled themselves forward. So I believe this is the last train that I certainly will have in my lifetime to see us catch, and it's possibly a time like this that we can use that to cut through some of these stubborn, bureaucratic, love affairs that we have had with ancient practices, which we actually need to take a hard look at. So I think rather than being very policy focused, I think we need to see very practically what are the key obstacles that need to be removed to get to where we are. So my presentation, I actually had two policies. One is to think outside in, and the other is to think of improving what we have rather than wanting to put new things here. So I think those are the two broad policies I feel we need. Nothing else. Everything else, I think, is just, we should just move on, removing what we don't need. A lot of what we have is adequate. We only have some of these, a few that we need to remove, and we need to have strong political leadership that will understand why removing them at this time is the only way forward.
Thank you, Amal. Let me turn to Ramesh just to understand, because when Amal spoke about policy, and one thing I remember is Sri Lanka forever wanted to be a regional logistics hub, but we know we've never, at least transport, there has been some policies maybe, but in port and logistics, we've never had a policy in Sri Lanka. And we've never really designed one. Do you think that's a problem in getting together people, especially given the given that transport and logistics cuts across so many ministries, so many agencies? Do you think some policy cohesion is required? Because everyone, one thing that what Amal and everybody else said is everyone seems to be having their own agendas and moving in different directions, but not in one direction. I would love to hear your thoughts, Ramesh, on that in going forward.
So I think there have been multiple policies, and in fact, the last one was 4 years in the making. It cut across 3 different ministers of shipping. It involved stakeholder groups from across the spectrum, but it's gathering dust somewhere. So, in the end, and again, like what Amal said, it's not complicated. I mean, we are in a business, the international transportation and logistics business. It's not rocket science. It's not unique to Sri Lanka. We've got glowing examples of successes on either side of us: Dubai to the west, Singapore and Malaysia to the east. And everybody knows what needs to be done, and we can't do it all ourselves. It is a business that requires input, because it is business that doesn't belong to us. So we have to have the Maersk Lines of this world, the MSCs of this world, the Hapag-Lloyds of this world, the ONEs of this world, the Schenkers, the DHLs, and they need to do their business. They can't be, dancing to silly Singapore when it wants to build a logistics park. It allocates, it either reclaims land or allocates 100 acres and creates a park. Now, and invites people to come and set up there and do all their businesses there. They don't care whether you bring people from Timbuktu or whether you hire them in Johor Bahru or in Singapore itself. And we shouldn't either, because it's a global business. Now, we got it right with the terminals, with SAGT, where I am, with CICT, and now with WCT coming up with the Adanis. And then we go backwards with ECT again. I mean, nonsensical. The SLPA is not the greatest terminal operator in the world. I mean, they're good. And we are where we are today because of the leadership of the SLPA and because of the role they have played as a brilliant landlord. And they have been a great facilitator. But then government still holds on to unnecessary things. We are holding on to, public, the marine services are still run by the government. So you have a greatly efficient terminals and basins, and then you have, a set of services, some of which are practices that go back 150 years. So, we really don't, policy is not magic. Policy is just doing what everyone else is doing in a sensible way and making it work, because we can leverage where we are. We can leverage the fact that we are a window and a gateway to today the 5th largest economy, definitely by 2040 the 2nd largest economy in the world. And we have to, and it can be done. I think, what we saw with the fuel pricing, necessity is the mother of all invention. What we could not do for the last 50 years happened literally overnight. Fuel prices and electricity prices, and the businesses must be able to afford to pay for it, or otherwise you change the way in which you do your business. Our power prices are ridiculously cheap. Our fuel prices are ridiculously cheap. And many people were paying 1,000 rupees for a litre of petrol, because they were paying, 500 rupees what the CPC charge, and another 500 rupees to a rascal to go and get it for them, or get it through the back door. So it's not it can be done. And to Amal's question of the Aragale, I mean, and Jeffries, I mean, our generation, I think, would have, I'm not being apologetic or anything like that, but the Aragaleas that happened in our generation took up guns and wanted to, kill people. And some of them did that for 30 years, some of them did for 2-3 years. And the predecessors of some of today's Aragalea were, didn't just simply protest at golfways. They tried to take over police stations and shoot the prime minister. So that it happened. I think the only good thing our generation did was we created this generation, which is hopefully going to do much better than what we did, and learn and not do the same things that we did, because we failed miserably. I think, in that sense, the only good thing we did was create the generation that did the Aragale, as I tell my children.
Thank you, Ramesh. So I would go back to Jeffrey, because you were talking about Aragale and you're the generation that Ramesh is talking about. I wanted to also understand, sometimes you can't shy away from discussing problems that really prevent us from moving forward. And I feel corruption and vested interests, especially by powerful groups, play a very critical role in blocking most of the progress. And I would like to hear your thoughts, Jeffrey, about how, on one hand, can technology solve some of this corruption to vested interest to other issues? And like the simple example was QR code, right? And there were a lot of corruption, a lot of this thing, but QR code actually managed to solve it to a large extent. So similarly, I would like to hear your thoughts and how would you do things differently from Ramesh, me, and Amal?
Oh, for sure.
Our generation.
Yes. So I think digitization is the solution, and in this democratic kind of environment, I think digitizing as much as possible will allow us to sort of get the information upfront. I don't think anyone knew how much of fuel was going around, and I think the QR code or the fuel pass sort of gave that visibility to every one of us, and I think we all now understand where the fuel is going, right? I think that's just a very simple example. I see it day in and out in what PICME does in Sri Lanka. We see where people are going, what's happening out there, what are the problems, how do we improve it? Obviously there's a lot of dynamics that comes into play, right? And I think it's a very simple thing, right? What is measured is managed well, right? And that's what digitization comes with, right? And of course, I think the future is around this, right? If we want to become this regional hub, we have to quickly digitize, and obviously the next phase of digitization also begins, which is with artificial intelligence and machine learning, but it all has to get digitized first, right? And I think that's the opportunity. If we don't take that opportunity now, just like Amal said, I don't know whether I will see another opportunity in the future.
Thank you. I would like to ask Dr. Siva as well, also Amal, when we are talking about digitization, obviously there are 100 things that can be done. But where do you think would be, where do you see the greatest benefits? And if we want to prioritize, what should be prioritized? Dr. Siva, would you like to share any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as everybody agreed in this room, modernization and the digitization and then disruptive technology are the key right now everybody is talking about. Some time back, how to solve a technical problem and how to solve political interferences, how to solve democratic structures. All these were put a stop by some disruptive technologies. Probably I leave Sahasara project explanation to Professor Amal Kumarage. That is one of the disruptive technology what we see in the recent past. We have tried, and is how successful, and also is connected to how this revenue leakage is handled and managed better. And likewise, this ICT applications are playing a major role, not only in bringing the process into a digitization, but through the digitization, there is a whole game change is happening. And then this manual data collections and manual documentation, paper-based documentation, all this is now almost possible. Almost everything is possible to digitize, but as Romesh said, still we are on a paper-based, believing on the paper-based, and we are still doing this digital documentation plus paper-based as a hybrid, because we so used to it, and we are very difficult. We are in a difficult situation to get rid of this paper-based system. And the third one is by this digitization. It's not only the process taken to a next step, but also for the future data-driven decision makings, because every information is digitized. So when the digitization is there, as Professor Kumarage said, right now almost all the institution has digital data, but they don't know what to do with this. So there must be an automated like IoTs and artificial intelligence. So the data must be analyzed and given the value addition of the data. So based on the data, the value added information to be there, so that the decision makers on the business side or the users on the user side, or all these people will get an added information through this digitization. And also as a policy, every country, like particularly the European countries, is going with zero emission, again touched by Professor Kumarage. So now we also Sri Lanka is part of it and part of the signatory in this zero emission. So we need to work on this one, and we need to go with the electric vehicles and green energy and solar energy, and we need to promote this because right now most of our electric vehicles which is running on the road are still electric vehicle, but the electricity is generated. We need to change this entirely from green energy so that we can go on a sustainability. So this sustainable transportation is also one of the key we need to go. That also connected with this modernization and the technology. I leave Professor Kumari also to join me to.
Yeah, thanks, Siva. So I think Romesh gave one idea of digitalization in the freight transport or in the external logistics of going actually paperless. So information on one portal can be viewed by people, seamlessly, that's one very clear application. Of course, what Sulfa is also doing is basically he's handling data. All what he's doing is actually giving visibility for the passenger where the taxi is, and for the taxi where the passenger is. That's all he's doing. And of course, he's adding to that, collecting the money and, paying the parties and things like that. But this is all data, exchange of data, and data today is so very valuable, particularly because people want to make real-time decisions, and that's the way the world is going, whether we like it or not. So, if, as Siva said, now for the last 1 year, we have been operating, or we have put 1,500 GPSs on buses in Kandy, almost every bus that serves Kandy. And we have an app ready, but we have not been able to, give this to the passenger to know where the bus is, And like you would have seen in other countries overseas, you can see the bus coming just like you would see on the Pick Me app, and you can get alerts to, go up to the bus stand and things like that. And more so, we have even integrated that to work with the railway schedules, and we can integrate it with even Sulfa's platform, so that a passenger can actually have visibility door to door, irrespective of what mode you need to do. So it's that kind of powerful use of data that will actually give people, particularly the young people, the reliability, the convenience to say, I don't need a car. And that is happening in many parts of the world now, So I think, so that's the first level, to actually give real-time data. Then comes the back-end operation of that, which is called data analytics. You collect with your IoT devices, you collect, millions, billions of data on a daily basis, which if you can actually analyze, you can cut down your inefficiencies hugely. You can stop things like corruption. Now, for example, we can, with the electronic ticket machine data, we can see how much money a bus conductor might be pilfering. We can actually set performance standards and give greater visibility because we have historical data collected. So we can actually cut down all of these, leakages that are happening in the transport sector, which actually cripples its commercial viability. Then actually we can use the data to improve services. Now I'm sure Sulfa is studying his data, and he knows how to position his fleet optimally at different times of the day, because that's where. So even before the customer thinks of, asking for a pick-me cab, Sulfa is aware that in this area at this time, so many taxis should be there, and finally, it's more efficient, it's more convenient, and that's how digital. So we are actually at the cusp of it, and unlike, the industrial revolution or whatever, we had to put in huge machinery and infrastructure. digital infrastructure today is actually, relatively inexpensive. And, we have the know-how in this country to do all of it, So I think this is something that we just cannot afford to miss. Not only in the transport sector, think of education, I mean, these are all areas where I think we need to champion together to say, Sri Lanka must not sink with this wave. We must ride the wave. We must overcome this. And I think transport, I think we are ready to move. I think, we have, all of us are talking the same language. We want it, it's there. I mean, Asikuda has been there for years, I mean, I can't think of a single reason why the switch cannot be done, Ramesh, in 24 hours, if it has to be done. Yes, Subhashini. So I think I stopped there. I get so emotional going further.
Thank you very much, Amma. I would like to turn to Ramesh because I think we have around 8 minutes left before we close. I would like to also give everyone an opportunity to have any final thoughts or any final say. And Ramesh, also, I would really like to this green energy, and we are at a time where we have to overhaul the entire fleet of buses, right? We are at a time we have to really rethink about on trains that we run on in this country. So this gives us an opportunity to really embrace this green wave and also the emission. And I'm sure for international competitiveness and export success and logistics success, this becomes critical because increasingly supply chains are getting audited. Right? Even if Sri Lanka is not interested, Europe is interested in knowing how goods come to Europe, from the rail to the ship to the bus that takes them, and the carbon footprint. So I would really like to hear your thoughts on that, Ramesh, and any other remarks you would like to leave with the audience.
Yeah, so I mean, Subhashini, I think everyone, the global shipping, container shipping has committed to a net zero by 2050. Many of the bigger companies have actually advanced that time to 10 years before that for themselves, as a target for themselves. And I think given our state of, the virtual halt that we came to over the last 8 months, particularly on the on the vehicle side, it's again a great time at which to make a quantum shift, like say, make a policy that, okay, we are not going to import any more internal combustion engine combustion engine vehicles, initially private transport, ever. Maybe by 2024, we cease that import altogether. And then we make it expensive for, like Siva said, you can own a vehicle. Everybody likes to own a vehicle. But if you use it on the road, when you use it, you pay a price. You pay the price for whatever you need to do. So I think the green shift, even in our ports, for instance, if you look at all the new ports, the new terminals, will be almost 100% green. Other than for the trucks, we possibly have all the lifting equipment, all of that will be electricity. So the urgency for us in terms of greening is how do we green our power supply? Now, we already start off at a much higher level than anyone else, than many other countries in the world. 34% of our energy is green, is hydroelectric as it is. And we have the ability to ramp that to 70 or 80% through wind and solar. The technology is there, the participants are there. I mean, I think we should simply be going ahead and doing this. And thereby we green the rest of the supply chain and the rest of the logistics chain, because you have your charging stations. If the electricity is green, then the shift to green transportation, electric buses, electric trains becomes one overall initiative. So, in a nutshell, just to go back, I think on the digitization, we have to get this paperless thing done. Our transactions have to be paperless. Our public transport needs to be digitized to the extent that all the ticketing, the scheduling, the fares, accessibility, all has to be digital. The feedback, has to be digital. We know how good is the bus, how good is the driver, was it on time? We need to start engaging with customers in buses and trains for feedback. We have to get I believe that the public transport has to be, we have to find a solution to make the profit motive work in some way. You know, it cannot be a subsidy. As long as it is a subsidy, there is no incentive to perform from within the unit. So I fully agree that we can't make it unaffordable. So we have to address the affordability factor in a different way by putting money in the hands of people who can't afford it, rather than subsidizing the bus or the train or the fuel or the road. And lastly, I think, you know, everyone needs to, the politicians, the public servants, and the private sector need to put their money where their mouths are, because we know that really there are no more chances. So, you know, we have to pay more taxes. We have to realize that we have to go by bus. You know, this, you know, I'm a manager, I got to go in a car. It doesn't work anymore. It can't work. So it's only when that shift happens that things will work. And we have to get over the phobia about government giving land to foreigners and about foreigners coming and taking our jobs. If 100,000 foreigners want to come here and take jobs, I think that will contribute more to the economy in terms of everything, in terms of consumption here, in terms of value add, in terms of all that they do, and in terms of tax. We should allow anyone to come here and tax them. It doesn't matter. That's exactly what Singapore does. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think there were two questions. Amal, I wonder whether you would like to respond either on the chat box or in your final remarks. One was on I think, the importance of the macroeconomic policy in transport policy when you were speaking about taxes on vehicles. It really, at the end of the day, is about fiscal policy. And bad fiscal policy, where we are depending for 50% of revenue, for customs generate 50% of revenue on imports, right? So and also the exchange rate policy. If you want to make any remarks on that, I will first give, and also there was a very particular question about how do you structure the agreements between transport contracts, concessional agreements and others, whether you would like to respond to that. You can do so on the chat in writing as well, if you feel that saves time. Jeffrey, I would like to give you a minute to share any of your final remarks or thoughts on the subject before we close.
Yeah, so I think first like to thank Central Bank for inviting me. Obviously, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. Obviously, we are all optimistic. We want these things to turn out well. What I've mentioned about the policy stuff, I think it's identified by Central Bank as well, according to their 2019 report. I think some action needs to be put in so that entrepreneurs in this space will evolve. I think there's a lot of talent in our country. I think if the right policies are put in, they will evolve. And then obviously with what Romesh said, we are a startup in Sri Lanka. We had the opportunity, or we still do have the opportunity to look at service in other countries around the world. But unfortunately, the situation such is that we've never been able to do that in the last 5 years. So I think that's something to think about, right? If we were to create technology unicorns and bring dollars into the country, we need to have the right policies to encourage that. That's what I would like to leave behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Siva, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so let me put it very briefly. As I touched upon this, we need to start on sustainable energy and sustainable transport and sustainable procurement. As some of you all mentioned, we need to start from ourselves, and all of us we must start from our education system. Sustainable consumption. If I don't want anything essential, I should not consume. That's the fundamental. We need to think individually and acting individually. As Romesh said, within this week, I twice visited my university. I came by bus, and I told to my students, we need to change by ourselves. So change must be coming from us, and then the change will be a mass. So I conclude with that sustainability And also, since I am from public transport must be given priority. And that priority also should be given not by the diesel engines, composition engines. All these must be converted to electric, and all these fuel stations has to gradually change their pumping station into a solar powered charging points. Thank you for the opportunity given by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Dr. Siva. Amal, you can conclude with your final thoughts.
Okay, I'll just do that in 1 minute, Subhashini. Just a few words I'll just leave for us to ponder. I think the two keywords on which the transportation future will have to be built is, one is data. We call it digitalization also, digital data. The other is green, green transport. And I think these will be the biggest, or the strongest foundations going into the future. And I think, that's one thought to take. The second one is that we need to, as much as we need to create new things, we need to disrupt things that are going on. And I think sometimes we concentrate on bringing new things without adequately focusing on disrupting what is disruptive, So I think there has to be a dual focus, that while we bring new things that work, we must effectively stop things that don't work. So I think particularly data is a means by which you can disrupt a lot of, even the corruption that has been raised in the chat box, these with the transparency issues and things like that. The third thing was about agreements, right? What are the new models? For example, one of the key, changes that is needed in the bus sector is to pay the suppliers by the kilometer they operate, and not by, the fare box collection. That's what stops buses from operating, outside of peak times. That's what encourages the intense competition during productive times, and no country in the world does this at this scale that we are having. 25,000 buses doing this, it just doesn't work. So this is an archaic, obsolete, system. And we've been trying to change that for the last 10, 15 years, or maybe more than that. Now there are so many other models that we can actually, learn from other countries that work very well. So how do we, Siva talked about the Sahasrara model, that's also been in the pipeline for 5 years now, waiting for a government to actually, deliver the baby, So macroeconomic policy, I think I've said a lot, and I think Treasury needs to rethink this whole thing about living off the importation of vehicles, which has now put us in this mess. As Ramesh was saying, I think the transport sector can actually cross-subsidize and manage it without being a burden to the government, right? Singapore does it, and many countries, actually, a lot of European countries are doing it now. So we can learn a few tricks from them as well as to how to do that. So that's all from now for me, and thank you, Subhashini, for moderating this program, and my appreciation to Central Bank for the invitation and the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you, all the panelists. It has been a very lively and an insightful discussion. And also I saw certain questions on the chat box. I'm sure Central Bank would answer them. And it has been, to summarize, I think what we really, when we are rethinking, obviously going digital was one of the priorities. Going green is a priority. And also another important thing is public demand, that as people, we need to demand the right things and act in the right way, and also be a little bit more aggressive in the way we hold the government accountable, or basically demand action from the government, because lack of action seems to be a big problem, even when there has been fabulous solutions designed. So let's hope going forward we can create this kind of conversations. I think these discussions and seminars are really important. And I would like to encourage the central bank to do this in Sinhala as well. Maybe you are already doing this in Sinhala and Tamil. It's very important that this message and this understanding reaches as many people as possible in the country. That is very important for change. And now I would like to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to moderate this session. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot in the process. Over to you, Kushan.
Yes, thank you very much, Subhashini, for moderating the discussion, ensuring many aspects are covered and discussed. Many thanks. And as you mentioned, we will consider doing this in different languages as well. That's indeed a fan. So with that, that marks the end of today's expert panel discussion. It was indeed a very interesting and productive event we had. So the CBS is delighted for being able to host this expert panel discussion with the patronage of leading experts of the transport and logistics sector. And it's our hope that discussions stemmed from this seminar will trigger some thoughts and essentially some actions in the time to come. At the conclusion of today's event, let me take this opportunity to extend my sincere gratitude to all eminent speakers, Professor Kumarage, Dr. Sivakumar, Mr. Romesh David, and Mr. Jeffrey Sulpa, and Mrs. Subhashini Pesika. The insightful thoughts you shared with us today added immense value to this important event. Thank you very much. And also on behalf of Director of Central Bank Studies, I wish to thank the Governor and the top management of Central Bank for supporting us to proceed with our proposal to conduct this webinar on this timely topic. Finally, I wish to thank all of you who tuned into this seminar and took part very actively in the discussion. And there were some questions regarding the recording of this video. So we will be uploading this discussion, all the video to Central Bank official official YouTube channel. So those who missed it fully or partially can watch it later. So we at Central Bank Studies will organize similar public events on time-relevant topics in the future as well. So please keep in touch with us. Thank you very much once again to all of you, and have a pleasant evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.